Leaders from every level of Canadian government are lashing out at Stellantis today. The automaker says it's reneging on plans to make Jeeps in Brampton, Ontario, and moving production to the U.S. instead.
The Prime Minister pushing back against Ontario's Premier, calling on him to get tougher on Donald Trump.
There's times to hit back and there's times to talk, and right now is the time to talk.
It began with one headline that shook both sides of the border. Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep, confirmed it would move production of its Compass model from Brampton, Ontario, to Illinois. The shift, worth roughly $13 billion in new U.S. investment, promised around 5,000 American jobs, but left 3,000 Canadian workers facing unemployment. For Washington, it looked like vindication. President Trump called it a win for American labor and proof that his aggressive tariff strategy was working. In the White House narrative, companies were finally coming home. But in Brampton, Ontario, the story felt very different. The mayor described the announcement as a punch to the gut for a city that had built cars for generations. Thousands of families now faced an uncertain future, while the local economy braced for the loss of wages, suppliers, and community support. Behind the emotion lay a deeper reality. Trump's tariffs, 25% on most Canadian goods and 10% on energy, had rewritten the economics of cross-border production. Stellantis was responding to pressure, not opportunity. The policy that aimed to protect U.S. manufacturing was forcing North America's most integrated industry to tear itself apart. And yet, amid the anger, Canada's national government stayed calm. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not call for revenge. Instead, he delivered one quiet message that defined the country's tone. Now is a time to talk.
Across Canada, frustration boiled over. In Brampton, local unions warned that the Stellantis move could trigger a domino effect, with other automakers reconsidering their Canadian operations. Auto parts suppliers feared they might follow the same path south, taking thousands of indirect jobs with them. Patrick Brown, the city's mayor, urged Ottawa to restore the retaliatory tariffs that had been lifted earlier in the year. He reminded reporters that both the federal and Ontario governments had invested heavily in retooling Stellantis' plants in 2022. Workers wondered whether that public money was now lost. Economically, the shock rippled outward. Data from Statistics Canada showed that automotive exports had already fallen by 9% between January and September 2025. The decline was steepest in Ontario, where steel and aluminum shipments had slowed after new U.S. duties took effect in February. Even industries outside autos, furniture, timber, and building materials were feeling the squeeze. Yet the impact in the United States was not as straightforward as the headline suggested. Higher tariffs had raised costs for American builders, and shipping data from the Port of Los Angeles in September showed a 12% slowdown in furniture and cabinet imports because of overlapping duties. In other words, the supposed victory for U.S. industry was also tightening pressure on its own consumers. In Canada, the anger was political but also strategic. Many provincial leaders wanted to fight back, to match tariffs with tariffs. But Ottawa hesitated. The Prime Minister's office believed that a loud response could escalate a trade war at the exact moment Canada needed stability. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government focused on what it called re-anchoring supply chains, supporting domestic sectors quietly while keeping diplomatic doors open.
So the strategy has to take all of that into account and deliver the results. We start from a position where we have a better deal than any other country in the world with the United States. 85% of our trade is free. The deals the Americans have signed with everyone else has tariffs on the core of the trade, and then higher tariffs on the strategic sectors. So we're starting from this stronger position.
When Carney finally appeared before reporters, his tone was measured. He acknowledged the pain in Ontario, but insisted that restraint was not weakness. Canada, he said, was already engaged in intensive negotiations with Washington across several key industries: energy, aluminum, steel, forestry, and autos. He planned to brief Ontario Premier Doug Ford on progress in those talks. Carney's broader message was that trade policy could not be managed through emotion. The country, he argued, must prepare for the upcoming USMCA review in 2026, when every clause of the North American trade agreement would be reassessed. Acting rashly now could jeopardize that process. He reminded Canadians that their country still enjoyed the best access to the U.S. market of any nation on Earth. According to data from the Department of Global Affairs, roughly 85% of Canada's exports enter the United States duty-free. By contrast, America's recent deals with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea all included tariff floors on major goods. Canada's existing framework, though strained, remained uniquely favorable. Carney's approach contrasted sharply with the rhetoric from local leaders. Where they saw betrayal, he saw leverage. His goal was to keep negotiations alive until the United States itself faced pressure to compromise, from rising prices, disrupted parts supplies, and a restless manufacturing base that relied on Canadian inputs. "There are times to hit back and times to talk," he said. "Right now is the time to talk." For Carney, dialogue was not surrender, it was positioning, a way to ensure that when the next round of trade talks begins, Canada still has cards left to play. As the weeks passed, the meaning of that restraint became clearer. Canada began to redirect its focus inward and outward at the same time. Provinces like Nova Scotia accelerated resource projects, fast-tracking exploration for lithium and other critical minerals. Federal agencies pushed investment toward domestic steel and battery component plants to keep the sector alive. Abroad, Ottawa intensified ties with partners outside Washington's orbit. Negotiations advanced with the European Union on expanding their clean energy framework, while trade missions to Japan and South Korea explored supply chain cooperation independent of U.S. oversight. Canada was no longer waiting for permission to act. Meanwhile, the United States faced growing logistical strain. Tariffs that once looked like a shield now acted like a tax on its own system. Auto analysts at S&P Global noted in an October 2025 report that vehicle assembly costs in the Midwest had risen nearly 14% year over year due to higher input prices and transport delays. The reshoring push was creating bottlenecks, not efficiency. Trump's claim of victory over Canada now looked less certain. The Stellantis move symbolized a political win, but economically, it revealed a fragile reality. Protectionism cannot isolate an integrated market without breaking its rhythm. Every action to weaken a partner risks weakening the network itself. For Canada, the road ahead remains difficult. Jobs have been lost, and communities like Brampton are still reeling. But Carney's decision to pause, to talk instead of retaliate, may define a new phase in the relationship. His message is pragmatic, that power in trade is not just about who strikes first, but who endures long enough to shape the outcome. The Stellantis episode was supposed to prove Trump's strength. Instead, it exposed how deeply connected North America's economies remain, and how a single tariff meant to punish can end up redrawing alliances, reshaping industries, and reminding the world that sometimes the quiet response is the most strategic one of all.
You know, President Trump wants to come after the jobs and create uncertainty, not only in Canada, but across the world.
And we're going to begin in Washington, where Prime Minister Mark Carney is heading for yet another high-stakes meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. A critical moment as Canada is seeking tariff relief.
The days before one of the year's most anticipated meetings, the mood in Washington feels tense. Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing to meet U.S. President Donald Trump on October 7, his second trip to the White House since taking office. Back home, critics demand results. In Ottawa, his team chooses every word carefully. But before Carney even boards his flight, the story shifts. In Quebec City, at the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Conference, several American governors from Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania speak out against the tariffs, straining relations between their country and Canada. They remind everyone that more than 55 million jobs depend on the cross-border economy. These are not foreign observers. They are Trump's own partners warning that his trade policies are hurting their communities. For years, Trump has described tariffs as proof of strength. Now, those same policies are drawing resistance from inside America. What was meant to pressure Canada is starting to pressure Washington itself. As Carney prepares for the meeting, he carries with him the unexpected support of U.S. governors who have publicly stood with Canada.
We are friends, we're allies.
Canada got some support from a delegation of governors from Great Lakes states, all of which are closely tied to the Canadian economy.
What is not helpful is the way in which the president has demeaned our neighbors in the north, suggesting that they should be the 51st state. I respect Canadian sovereignty.
The reason is simple economics. The Great Lakes region is one of the most integrated industrial corridors in the world. The auto industry, steel producers, and aluminum smelters on both sides of the border operate as a single system. When tariffs slice through that network, they don't separate rivals from friends. They break the same machine both depend on. In automobiles, for example, a single North American car crosses the border several times before reaching the showroom. Parts made in Windsor often travel to Detroit for assembly and return to Ontario for finishing. Each tariff on metals or components adds cost at every crossing. For factories in Michigan and Ohio, that means higher prices and slower schedules. The metals that feed those plants tell the same story. Canada supplies roughly 90% of the primary aluminum imported by the United States, most used in cars and aircraft. Steel from Hamilton and Sault Ste. Marie becomes the raw material for mills in Illinois and Pennsylvania. When Washington taxes those imports at 25 to 50%, U.S. manufacturers pay more for materials they cannot source domestically. Energy links reinforce the dependency. Pipelines and power lines cross the border daily, keeping refineries and auto plants running. Ontario and Quebec rely on U.S. natural gas, while American states rely on Canadian electricity and oil. The supply chain moves in both directions. That is why the governors of Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are alarmed. Every new tariff threatens thousands of local jobs, from assembly lines in Detroit to ports along Lake Superior. Even brief disruptions ripple through transport and retail. By defending Canada, these governors are protecting their own voters. They know that punishing Canada means punishing themselves. Their message is practical. Keep the border open or risk breaking an economy that sustains both nations. For Carney, that shared interest transforms his trip. He represents not only Canada, but an industrial region stretching from Ontario's auto belt to Ohio's steel towns. Out of that conference emerges a quiet but powerful alliance. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford and Quebec's Premier François Legault stand with their U.S. counterparts to stress cooperation over confrontation. For decades, the Great Lakes region has functioned as one economy. Cars assembled in Detroit rely on parts from Windsor. Aluminum from Quebec feeds aerospace plants in New York. This regional unity gives Carney an advantage ahead of his meeting. He can present himself not as a foreign petitioner, but as a partner speaking for a shared industrial base. The governor's support offers political cover and moral leverage in Washington. Across the Midwest, workers and business owners are realizing that their prosperity depends on the same open border that Trump's tariffs are closing. In Washington, Carney's team is finalizing briefing notes for the October 7 meeting. According to CBC News and Radio Canada, the main goal is partial relief on steel tariffs and a framework for future reductions. Officials are careful not to raise expectations. Trump's unpredictability is well known in Ottawa. The White House is also under pressure from a partial government shutdown and business groups warning of higher costs. Within that environment, Carney will argue that Canada is a trusted ally whose industries are vital to U.S. growth and security. His leverage comes from three fronts. First, critical minerals. Canada supplies nickel, cobalt, and lithium, all listed by the U.S. Department of Defense as strategic. Second, defense spending. Carney's plan to expand Canada's military budget by tens of billions could translate into contracts for U.S. suppliers if trade tensions ease. Third, political support from U.S. governors urging tariff relief. Trump still holds the power to adjust or keep duties under Section 232, but rising frustration from border states makes a limited compromise possible. Analysts expect any early progress to center on aluminum, where U.S. factories rely heavily on Canadian imports. Lumber, tied to domestic politics, will likely remain unchanged. As the meeting nears, the real question is not whether Carney secures everything he wants, but whether Trump can afford to keep everything he has. Whatever happens on October 7, the political landscape in North America has already shifted. Trump's tariffs, once seen as a display of power, are now testing his own coalition. The Governors' Conference in Quebec City was a warning that economic pain does not stop at the border. In a region so integrated, punishing a neighbor often means punishing yourself. For Canada, this week is a moment to prove that patience and strategy can outlast bluster. Carney is entering the talks with a clear message that Canada's strength lies not only in its resources, but in its relationships with workers, businesses, and now with American leaders who see their futures linked to its success. The tariff war of 2025 has no victors yet, but the debate has changed. When American governors stand beside Canadian premiers to defend a shared economy, it signals a new kind of politics, one that recognizes the real battle is not between nations, but between cooperation and self-inflicted harm. As the White House meeting draws near, both countries wait. For Trump, the choice is whether to double down or step back. For Carney, the test is whether he can turn growing American frustration into meaningful relief. And for millions of workers across the Great Lakes, the stakes could not be clearer. Their jobs and the future of North America's economy now depend on what happens next in Washington.
We've taken in trillions of dollars. And by the way, all these countries signed agreements, as an example. They're all happy. Everybody's happy.
It's not a win for anybody. It's a miserable deal.
Time has already delivered its verdict. The tariffs launched by President Trump were supposed to revive American industry and bring in waves of foreign investment. Instead, even though a few trade deals have been signed, the evidence already shows the opposite.
Well, back in July, Seoul and Washington shook hands on a framework deal. South Korea would channel $350 billion in investment into the U.S., and in return, the U.S. would roll back some of its tariffs on Korean goods. But the deal isn't signed. Why?
And I think more generally, the commitment on the EU side to invest in the U.S. Manufacturing economy, very hard to see how that can happen.
The U.S. economy has not gained strength from these measures, and the promise of massive new capital has not materialized. From South Korea to Europe, announcements of hundreds of billions of dollars in investment remain stuck on paper. And most recently, a raid in Georgia has cast an even darker shadow over America's reputation as a safe place to invest. If allies and partners hesitate, if they question whether their workers will be welcomed or handcuffed, who will still risk putting money into the United States?
Add to this the recent storm, the Georgia raid. Over 300 South Korean workers were detained on immigration grounds. That has added fear among Korean companies.
The shock in South Korea is still fresh. In early September, more than 300 engineers and technicians from Hyundai and LG were detained in an immigration raid at a plant under construction in Georgia. They were flown back home on a special charter flight, and not a single one was charged with a crime. For families in Seoul, it was a humiliating moment. For executives in both companies, it was a warning that the U.S. may not be a reliable partner for large-scale projects. This came at the worst possible time. Just weeks earlier, Washington and Seoul had announced a framework where tariffs on Korean exports could be capped at 15% if South Korea delivered a $350 billion investment package. But the deal has stalled. The Korean president publicly warned that without a currency swap, such a transfer could destabilize his entire economy, even triggering a crisis like the one in 1997. The message is clear. Unless the U.S. provides financial guarantees and restores trust, that money will not flow. Instead of opening the door to investment, tariffs and raids have created hesitation. Europe offers another case where the promise has not matched reality. In September, Washington and Brussels celebrated a deal that capped tariffs at 15% and included an announcement of $600 billion in European investment by 2029. But the number is aspirational.
Not clear at all how the EU will be able to buy more energy from the USA, whether and how it will invest more in US manufacturing.
The European Union can sign agreements, yet the actual capital must come from individual governments and companies. No one has explained who will contribute, when funds will be released, or how they will be distributed. Public opinion polls across the continent show strong skepticism. Many Europeans question why they should send capital abroad when their own economies are struggling. What looks like a triumph on paper remains uncertain in practice. Canada, by contrast, has chosen a different path. Ottawa has not rushed to sign a deal with Washington. Instead, it is concentrated on nation-building projects. From critical minerals and energy infrastructure to port expansions and housing programs, the Canadian government is presenting itself as a stable destination for long-term capital. At a time when U.S. policies generate uncertainty, Canada is positioning itself to become a safer place for investors in North America. The contrast is striking. While Europe and South Korea hesitate, Canada is showing that caution and domestic focus can be more attractive than flashy but risky promises. Taken together, these examples lead to one conclusion: Trump's tariff policy has backfired. The numbers look impressive when announced, but they do not translate into real dollars on American soil. Instead of strengthening U.S. industry, the approach has fueled anxiety among partners and slowed the flow of foreign direct investment. Independent economic research published in mid-2025 confirmed that reciprocal tariffs reduce U.S. growth, increase inflation, and push capital away from the country. When that is combined with immigration raids on allied workers and financial demands that partners see as destabilizing, the result is predictable. The lesson is that tariffs can create headlines, but they cannot create trust. Without trust, the hundreds of billions in promised investment will not arrive. And without that capital, America risks falling behind, even as its closest neighbors prepare to take the lead.